The sonar ping came at 0342 hours, faint and irregular, like a heartbeat heard through water. Lieutenant Commander James Riley stood in the conning tower of USS Cavalla, his hand resting on the periscope housing, feeling the submarine's gentle roll as she ran at periscope depth through the Philippine Sea. The air inside the boat was thick with humidity, and the smell of diesel fuel, cooking oil, unwashed bodies, and the peculiar metallic tang that came from breathing recycled air for days on end. 72 men lived in this steel tube, 311 feet long and barely 27 feet wide, sharing bunks in shifts, eating meals standing up, existing in a state of controlled tension that never quite dissipated. "Contact bearing 350, the sonar man called softly. His name was Kowalczyk, a kid from Pittsburgh who'd worked in a steel mill before the war, and claimed he could identify ship types by the sound of their screws alone. "Multiple contacts, big ones. Range, 14,000 yards, maybe 15. Riley moved to the sonar station, crouching beside Kowalczyk in the cramped compartment. The oscilloscope showed green traces dancing across black screen, ghost images of ships moving through darkness. "How many?" "At least 6, sir. Maybe more. They're in formation, steaming fast, 20 knots or better." "Task force," Riley said quietly. The words hung in the humid air. A Japanese task force moving at night, far from any known convoy route, which meant either a battle group or a carrier group, and either way it meant targets worth the risk of surfacing for a better look. He straightened, his back protesting from weeks of bending in low compartments. He was 31 years old, but felt 50. Command did that to you, especially submarine command, where every decision could mean the difference between a successful patrol and becoming one more boat that never came home. Cavalla was on her maiden patrol, commissioned just 3 months ago, and Riley had driven his crew hard during training, knowing that submarine warfare in 1944 was less about mechanical reliability and more about whether men could function when surrounded by ocean pressure that would crush them like tin cans if the hull failed. "Take her up to 60 feet, he ordered. "Nice and slow. I want a look." The diving officer, a veteran named Chen, who'd survived 2 war patrols on another boat, worked the controls with practiced precision. Cavalla rose through the darkness, the deck tilting slightly, ballast tanks adjusting, trim maintained. At 60 feet, Riley raised the periscope and pressed his face against the rubber eyepiece. Darkness. Nothing but empty ocean under starlight. He rotated the periscope slowly, searching the horizon. There, dark shapes against darker water, silhouettes barely visible. He counted them. 1, 2, 3 destroyers in escort formation, 2 cruisers in the center, and behind them, larger than the others, a shape that made his breath catch. A carrier. Not just any carrier. Even at this distance, even in darkness, he recognized the distinctive profile of a Shōkaku class, one of Japan's premier fleet carriers, fast and heavily armed, capable of carrying over 70 aircraft. She was running with minimal lighting, just the faint glow of navigation lamps, her flight deck empty and cleared for night operations. Riley could see the slight wake she threw, white foam against black water, and the way her escorts maintained perfect station around her, like protective wolves. "Down scope," he said, stepping back. His heart was racing, but his voice remained steady. Training took over when instinct wanted to panic. "Sound general quarters. Silent running. All ahead 1/3. The general quarters alarm was a muted buzzing instead of the klaxon they'd use on the surface. Men moved to their stations with practiced efficiency. No running, no shouting, just the soft padding of rubber-soled shoes on deck plates and the whispered acknowledgements as each compartment reported ready. In 90 seconds, Cavalla transformed from a drifting steel cylinder into a weapons platform ready to kill. Riley gathered his officers in the conning tower, Chen, the diving officer, Ramirez, the torpedo officer, and Mitchell, the executive officer who'd been sleeping in the wardroom and now stood blinking in the red combat lighting. They were all young, all untested in real combat, all aware that the next few hours would define their careers and possibly end their lives. "We have a carrier," Riley said without preamble. "Shōkaku class, making 20 knots, heading roughly south-southwest. 6 escorts in standard protective screen. Range currently 13,000 yards and opening." "She's running away from us," Mitchell observed. "For now, but look at her course." Riley traced a line on the plotting table with his finger. "She's headed for the San Bernardino Strait. Has to be. That's the only passage through the Philippines that can accommodate a carrier, which means sometime in the next 12 hours she'll have to slow down to navigate the strait, and when she does, we'll be waiting." "That's a lot of ocean to search," Ramirez said, "and a lot of escorts between us and her." "Then we'd better not miss." Riley straightened. "Chen, I want you to plot an intercept course, not direct. We can't outrun her on the surface and we can't chase her submerged. But if we can get ahead of her track, position ourselves along her projected route, we might get a shot when she enters the strait." "How far ahead?" 60 miles, maybe 70. Put us right at the entrance to San Bernardino. She'll have to pass within a few thousand yards of that position." Chen studied the chart, his pencil moving across the paper in quick calculations. "We can do it if we surface. Run at full speed for 6 hours, dive before dawn, wait for her to come to us." "Then that's what we'll do." Riley looked at each man in turn. "Understand what we're committing to. We're going to drive ahead of a carrier battle group, submerge in restricted waters, and attack a target surrounded by destroyers trained specifically to kill submarines. The odds of getting away clean are not good. The odds of getting away at all are worse. But that carrier was at Pearl Harbor. She struck Wake Island, Port Moresby, Ceylon. She's killed thousands of our men, and right now, right this moment, she's vulnerable. We may never get another chance like this." No one spoke. The submarine's ventilation system hummed softly. Somewhere aft, a pump kicked on with a distant thud. Finally, Mitchell said, "When do we surface?" "Now, before we lose contact." Riley moved to the ladder. "Battle station's surface. I want all 4 engines online. We're going to run her ragged." Cavalla surfaced at 0408 hours into a night so dark that the ocean and sky merged into one continuous void. The lookouts scrambled up through the bridge hatch, scanning for aircraft, while below the diesel engines roared to life, their thunder filling the submarine with vibration and noise. Riley stood on the bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the horizon for any sign they'd been spotted. The Japanese task force was invisible now, beyond visual range, but radar showed them clearly. 6 blips moving steadily southwest at 22 knots. Cavalla drove forward at 17 knots, her diesels straining, throwing a white bow wave that glowed with phosphorescence. The wind was warm and humid, carrying the smell of distant land. The Philippines, somewhere over the horizon, still occupied by Japanese forces who would kill any American submariner unlucky enough to be captured. Riley divided the night into 2-hour watches, rotating his officers to keep them sharp. He remained on the bridge for the entire run, drinking coffee that tasted like diesel fuel and watching the radar screen through the bridge hatch. The Japanese force maintained course and speed, apparently unaware they were being stalked. Why would they expect a submarine this far out? American boats usually operated closer to the Japanese home islands or along major convoy routes. Out here in the open Philippine Sea, they probably felt safe. They were wrong. At 0925 hours, with the sun climbing toward its zenith and the ocean turning from black to deep blue, Cavalla reached her intercept position. The entrance to San Bernardino Strait was visible as a gap between 2 islands, the water there showing lighter colour from shallow reefs and tidal currents. Riley took one last look around. Empty ocean in all directions, no aircraft, no patrol boats, then gave the order. "Dive the boat. Take her to 100 feet. Rig for silent running." Cavalla slid beneath the surface with practiced efficiency. The bridge cleared, the hatch sealed, ballast tanks flooding. The roar of diesels gave way to the electric hum of the motors as the submarine descended into blessed cool darkness. The air temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Men wiped sweat from their faces and settled into their stations, knowing the waiting had begun. In the control room, Riley studied the plot. If his calculations were correct, the Japanese force would arrive at this position in approximately 4 hours. They'd be moving slower by then, preparing to navigate the strait, their formation more compact. The carrier would be in the center, protected by her escorts, but necessarily closer to them. And somewhere in that tight cluster of ships, there would be a firing solution. A brief window when torpedo tubes aligned with target and the laws of physics and geometry converged into possibility. He tried not to think about the 1,000 ways this could go wrong. Torpedoes that ran deep and passed under the target. Torpedoes that ran shallow and broke surface prematurely. Torpedoes that simply failed to detonate because the Mark 14's magnetic exploder was still unreliable, despite 2 years of complaints from submarine commanders. Or worse, escorts that detected Cavalla before she could fire, forcing her deep while depth charges rained down, the pressure hull groaning under explosive impacts that crept closer with each detonation. "Sir," Kowalczyk called from sonar. "Multiple contacts bearing 035. They're right where we thought they'd be." Riley moved to the sonar station. The screen showed clear return echoes now, sharp and distinct. "Speed?" "Slowing. Maybe 15 knots now. They're forming up for the straight passage." "Range?" 8,000 yards. Closing. All ahead dead slow. Bring her to periscope depth." Cavalla crept upward like a hunting shark, rising towards silhouetted prey. At 62 feet, Riley raised the periscope and made a quick 360-degree sweep. Clear sky, empty ocean, no air patrol. He rotated back to bearing 035, and there they were, closer than before, close enough to count individual vessels. The destroyers were spread in a protective semicircle, their bows throwing spray as they scanned for submarines with their sonar. The cruisers steamed behind them, their gun batteries trained outward. And in the center, magnificent and vulnerable, the carrier. She was closer than he'd dared hope, perhaps 6,000 yards, well within torpedo range. Her flight deck was still empty, aircraft stowed below, but Riley could see crew members moving about. Tiny figures going about their duties with no idea death was watching them through a periscope lens. "Downscope. Ramirez, prepare tubes 1 through 4. We're going for a spread shot. Set depth at 10 feet, speed high. I want them running hot, straight, and normal." "Aye, sir. Tubes 1 through 4 ready in 90 seconds. Riley's mouth was dry. His hands wanted to shake, but he forced them still. This was it. The moment every submarine captain dreamed of and feared in equal measure. A carrier in his sights. No friendly forces nearby to interfere. No air cover overhead. Just 2 ships alone on an empty ocean, predator and prey, and the next few minutes would determine which was which. "Up scope." The periscope rose and Riley pressed his face to the eyepiece, his right hand on the bearing ring, his left on the range estimator. The carrier was turning slightly, adjusting course to enter the strait. Her profile was perfect, a fat, broadside target presenting maximum surface area. The range was closing, 5,000 yards, 4,800, 4,600. "Bearing mark," he called. 033, Mitchell replied, reading the bearing from the repeater. "Range mark. 4,400 yards. Angle on the bow, starboard 20. Ramirez was working the TDC, the torpedo data computer. His hands moving across dials and switches, feeding in bearing, range, target speed, target course. The mechanical calculator whirred and clicked, solving the geometric problem of where to aim the torpedoes so they'd intercept a moving target thousands of yards away. "Solution ready," Ramirez said. "Gyro angles set. Fire 1. Riley watched through the periscope as the first torpedo shot from its tube, a blast of compressed air that rocked the submarine slightly. "Fire 2. Another torpedo away. "Fire 3. Fire 4. 4. Mark 14 torpedoes, each carrying 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, were running toward the carrier at 46 knots. They'd take 2 minutes and 40 seconds to reach their target. Either they'd hit and the carrier would die, or they'd miss and Cavalla would die. There was no middle ground. The escorts would have heard the torpedo launches, would be converging on Cavalla's position, their sonars pinging, their depth charges ready. Down scope, take her deep, all ahead full, right full rudder. Make depth 300 feet. Cavalla dove, her bow angling down sharply, her motors straining. Behind them, the torpedoes ran on, invisible, relentless, each one a gamble that 2 years of training and 3 months of preparation would pay off in explosive violence. Riley counted in his head. 100 seconds, 110, 120. The submarine was passing 200 feet now, still diving, trying to get under the thermal layer before the escorts arrived. The sonar operator was calling out bearing changes, tracking the torpedoes by their propeller noise, guiding them to target by sheer force of will. 140 seconds, Riley said aloud. They should be hitting any... The first explosion was distant but unmistakable, a deep thud that travelled through the water and rattled Cavalla's hull. The second followed 3 seconds later, then the third. The fourth never came. Dud or miss, they'd never know which. 3 hits, Ramirez said quietly. 3 hits on a carrier. Men started to cheer, but Riley silenced them with a gesture. Silent running. The escorts are coming. Chen, level off at 300 feet. Kill all unnecessary electrical loads. Nobody moves, nobody makes a sound. The celebration died. The reality of their situation reasserted itself. They'd hit the carrier, possibly mortally wounded her, but now they had to escape 6 angry escorts who knew exactly where to look. The submarine fell silent, men standing frozen at their stations, breathing shallow, listening. The first depth charge detonated at 13:47 hours, 500 yards astern and too shallow to hurt them. But it was close enough to send vibrations through the hull, close enough to shake dust from overhead pipes and make the lights flicker. More explosions followed. A pattern of 4 charges, then silence, then another pattern. The Japanese were working a search grid, trying to bracket Cavalla's position, waiting for a return echo that would let them zero in for the kill. Riley stood in the control room, watching the depth gauge, watching the inclinometer, watching his crew handle the stress of being hunted. Some men were praying. Some stared at nothing. Some worked their stations with mechanical precision, using routine as armor against fear. Kowalczyk kept his headphones pressed tight to his ears, calling out destroyer bearings in a monotone voice that never wavered. Destroyer bearing 090, range 1,000 yards and closing. Destroyer bearing 345, range 1,200 yards. Destroyer bearing... Another pattern of depth charges, closer this time. The submarine rolled slightly with the concussion. A pipe fitting cracked and sprayed mist until a damage control party sealed it with rubber and hose clamps. The lights went out, came back, went out again before the electricians got them stabilized on emergency power. 310 feet, Chen reported. Hull integrity holding. Maintain depth. Maintain course. The hunting continued for 3 hours. The destroyers would ping with their sonar, hear something that might be a submarine, or might be a school of fish, or a temperature gradient, then drop patterns of depth charges that walked across the ocean floor in thunderous progressions. Each pattern came closer. Each explosion tested Cavalla's hull and crew a little more. Paint chips fell from the overhead. Gauges cracked. A man in the engine room fainted from heat and stress and had to be carried to his bunk. But the submarine held together. And slowly, gradually, the explosions grew more distant. The destroyers were widening their search, losing contact, running low on depth charges. By 1700 hours the water was silent except for the distant throb of screws as the Japanese task force continued towards San Bernardino Strait without their carrier. Riley finally allowed himself to relax slightly. Sonar, report. Multiple contacts moving away, sir. Bearing south, range increasing. They're leaving the area. And the carrier? A pause. No propeller noise from the carrier, sir. She's either stopped or sunk. Stopped or sunk. Either way, mission accomplished. Riley looked around the control room at his exhausted crew. They'd done it. They'd stalked and killed one of the most valuable targets in the Japanese fleet, and they'd survived. Secure from silent running. Damage control parties report. Sonarman, maintain passive listen on those destroyers. If they come back, I want to know immediately. Reports came in over the next 20 minutes. Minor flooding in the forward torpedo room, already controlled. Cracked piping in 2 compartments, temporary repairs in place. Several blown fuses and burned-out electrical components. Nothing critical. Nothing that would prevent them from reaching port. At 18:30 hours, with the sun setting and the ocean growing dark again, Riley gave the order to surface. Cavalla rose from the depths like a breaching whale, her conning tower breaking surface first, then her deck, water cascading from the superstructure. The bridge hatch opened, and Riley climbed up into humid evening air that tasted like freedom. The ocean was empty in all directions. No destroyers, no aircraft, no survivors. Just endless water under a sky turning purple with dusk. Riley trained his binoculars toward where the carrier had been, and saw nothing but spreading oil slick catching the last light, rainbow colors on dark water marking where something large had died. Below him, the crew was celebrating quietly, sharing cigarettes and coffee, telling each other exaggerated versions of what had happened. They'd earned it. They'd done what they came to do. They'd struck a blow against an enemy that had seemed invincible just 2 years ago. But Riley couldn't shake the image of that oil slick. Somewhere beneath it were men like his crew. Sailors doing their jobs, following orders, believing in their cause just as strongly as he believed in his. They'd been on that carrier when the torpedoes hit, had felt the deck buckle, had heard the explosions, had tried to escape as the ship took on water, and listed, and finally went down. How many survived? How many were still down there, trapped in sealed compartments, waiting for death? Sir, Mitchell had climbed up to the bridge. Permission to send success message to Comsubpac? Granted. Report 1 carrier Shokaku class attacked and severely damaged, probably sunk. 3 torpedo hits confirmed. Cavalla departing patrol area, returning to Pearl Harbor. Yes, sir. Mitchell hesitated. Hell of a first patrol, Skipper. Yeah. Riley lowered his binoculars. The oil slick was fading now, dissolving into the ocean as night fell. Hell of a first patrol. They reached Pearl Harbor 14 days later, having run submerged during daylight hours and surfaced only at night to recharge batteries. The return trip was uneventful but tense. Every sonar contact was a potential threat, every aircraft a possible enemy. But luck held, and they arrived safely, sliding past the anti-submarine nets at the harbour entrance and tying up at the submarine base to find an admiral waiting on the pier. The confirmation came that evening. Japanese radio intercepts reported the loss of carrier Shokaku, torpedoed by submarine northwest of San Bernardino Strait. She'd sunk 3 hours after being hit, taking 272 men with her. Her escorts had rescued 570 survivors. The remaining crew was listed as missing, presumed dead. Riley received the Navy Cross in a ceremony 2 weeks later. His crew received commendations and extra leave. Cavalla received a refit and a battle flag with 1 carrier symbol painted on it. And then they went back out because the war wasn't over and there were more targets and more missions and more chances to die far from home in a steel tube under thousands of feet of water. Riley made 3 more war patrols before the war ended. He sank 2 freighters, damaged a destroyer, and spent 63 hours being depth-charged by escorts that came closer to killing him than he ever admitted in official reports. He received more medals, a promotion, and a reputation as one of the Pacific Fleet's best submarine commanders. None of it meant as much as that first patrol, that first carrier, that moment when he'd looked through a periscope and seen a target he'd been trained to kill since the day he entered the submarine service. After the war, he stayed in the Navy for 20 more years, commanding diesel boats and then nuclear boats, teaching at the submarine school, watching the service transform from diesel-electric boats that could barely stay submerged for 24 hours into nuclear-powered vessels that could remain underwater for months. Technology changed, tactics changed, the enemy changed, but the fundamental equation remained the same. Men in a metal cylinder, hunting other men in other metal cylinders, each side trying to sink the other before being sunk themselves. He retired in 1965 and moved to Connecticut with his wife Margaret, who'd waited through 5 war patrols and 20 years of deployments with patience he never fully understood or deserved. They bought a small house near the coast where he could see the ocean from his bedroom window, and every year on June 19th, the date Cavalla sank Shokaku, he would stand at that window and remember. The oil slick dissolving into darkness, the depth charges that came so close, the 3 explosions that meant 3 torpedoes had found their target, the men who died because he'd done his job well, the men on his crew who lived because he'd done his job well, the impossible mathematics of war that turned killing into virtue and survival into luck. He never spoke about it to anyone except other submariners, and even then only in the coded language of men who'd shared the same experience. What was there to say? That he'd been frightened the whole time? That he still dreamed about being depth-charged, about hull failure, about drowning in darkness while the pressure crushed his submarine into scrap metal? That he'd killed 1,272 men he'd never met and would carry their weight for the rest of his life? The Navy called it a great victory. The newspapers called it heroic. His crew called it the best patrol they ever sailed, and Riley called it Thursday, because that's what it had been. Just another Thursday in June 1944, when men fought and died in service of causes they believed in, on an ocean that kept no record and offered no judgment. He died in 1988, 75 years old, survived by his wife and 3 children who'd grown up hearing stories about their father, the submarine captain, but never quite understanding what that meant. They buried him with military honours at Arlington National Cemetery. The ceremony included a 3-volley salute and taps played by a Navy bugler, the mournful notes drifting across the ordered rows of white headstones. Among the mourners was a Japanese man in his late 60s, wearing a dark suit and carrying a single white chrysanthemum. No one knew who he was or why he'd come. He placed the flower on Riley's casket, bowed once in the precise manner of his culture, and walked away without speaking to anyone. Later, Margaret found a note tucked into the flower's wrapping. It was written in careful English on expensive paper, the handwriting old-fashioned and precise. I was a sailor on Shōkaku. I survived because a shipmate pushed me through a hatch before it sealed. I have lived 50 years with his sacrifice. I came to honor the man who made that sacrifice necessary, and to say what we never could say then. We were enemies, but we were also the same. May both our ghosts find peace. The note was unsigned. Margaret kept it in her Bible for the rest of her life, never showing it to anyone, never speaking of the Japanese man who'd travelled 8,000 miles to stand at her husband's grave. Some things were too complicated for words, too heavy for explanation. The war had made enemies of men who might have been brothers. It had demanded killing from men who'd been taught not to kill. It had created heroes and villains from ordinary people who'd simply done what was required of them. And 50 years later, here was proof that someone remembered, that someone understood, that the weight of it had been carried by both sides across decades and oceans, and the unbridgeable gap between victor and vanquished. The ocean keeps such truths. It always has. And in its depths, rusting and forgotten, submarines and carriers rest side by side, their battles over, their crews long gone, waiting for a time when no one remembers why they fought, or what it cost, or whether any of it mattered at all.